And so welcome, folks. Today's date is May 5th, 2026, and the topic is going to be on climate change, planning for electric vehicles, and community health. Residents in rural areas, on average, must travel further and have limited options for transit, making personal vehicles and increasingly electric vehicles an essential part of everyday mobility. So my name is Sage Milne, and I'm your moderator for this webinar and a research assistant at Gateway. Before we begin, this conversation will discuss themes of health, land, and sustainability. The Gateway office is located on the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. It is part of the Huron Tract Treaty number 29 and the Saugeen Tract Treaty number 45 and a half. These groups have served as stewards of the land since time immemorial, and as we discuss planning and the environment, Gateway advocates for respecting the land, the people, and working to co-design positive transformation. And I'm so happy to be welcoming a group of speakers all passionate about promoting positive change in rural transportation systems. Dr. Wayne Caldwell is a professor emeritus at the University of Guelph's School of Environmental Design and Rural Development and serves as a Gateway Research Chair. Derry Wallis is a climate change and energy specialist. She has a career working with both municipal and conservation authorities. She published an article in Municipal World exploring some of the myths and realities of electric vehicle ownership. And Jason Geberdt is the manager of IT infrastructure and operations at the County of Huron. He is also a passionate owner of an electric vehicle. The views and opinions of many speakers in this webinar may not reflect Gateways, but we believe in providing a platform for meaningful discussion. So I will pass off this conversation to Wayne to get started.
Thanks very much, Sage, and welcome, folks. Thanks for having an interest in this topic and for being here to explore it with us. We're still learning about the topic, and we look forward to your perspectives as time goes by over the length of our presentation. For me, it's really interesting to reflect back on my career and my life and think of those things that have changed over time. And I can think of how computers have evolved. I can think of how AI is now evolving. And I would never have thought that 20 years ago, we might be sitting in a situation today where EVs are pretty common and certainly a way for the future. And I think a way that we will certainly see become even more prominent as time goes by. So thanks for the opportunity to share this with folks, and thanks to Gateway for sponsoring this presentation. And I come to this with a lens as a professional planner, someone who has worked with communities over a long period of time, someone who's worked at the university looking at issues of community and how are communities put together and how do they function well. And this notion of a healthy rural community is really important, and I think it translates into the health outcomes the Gateway would hope to achieve as well. And it's this notion of thinking about community from the perspective of physical health, economic health, environmental health, and social well-being. And when we put all of those things together, we start to think about communities in a slightly different way, in a way that can be positive and helpful as we move forward into the future. And as part of that, it's this notion of the determinants of health. And many of you will be familiar with this. And if we look, I'm not sure if your mouse is showing up on the screen as I move things around, but the issue of climate change is something that's really key to all of us. And I think it's maybe fallen a little bit into the background because of things happening south of the border, but climate change remains critical to all of us. And when we start to look at these issues of the determinants of health, it is those things which impact us in the communities within which we live, and what are they? And things like natural environment, built environment, activities and how we move about, the local economy and the importance of that, and the community, and how that ties together in terms of how people function in that community. And what are those determinants? What are those things that are givens that impact our health and the way that we might live and how we function within our community as well? So what we try to do is we look at this topic, we try to bring to a rural lens, like what is it about rural that's important to this topic? What is it about climate change and how does that impact us? And certainly recognizing transportation, and I know Gateway has sponsored other presentations looking at transportation as well. and that EVs may seem like a transportation issue, which they are, but I would suggest that they're also fundamentally connected to health outcomes within the communities within which we live. So question is, what do EVs have to do with it? And it's worth recognizing that within Ontario, transportation is responsible for 32% of the emissions. So if we think of climate change and carbon, how is it that transportation impacts us? And in Ontario, transportation is a key contributor to carbon emissions. So we also think about rural communities. Within a rural community, if I want to get anywhere, unless I'm walking or on my bicycle, I'm into a car or transportation. I live on a farm, and in order to get about within the community, I am dependent upon a vehicle. And I'm certain that many of the people listening today, if you reflect on your situation, you probably are also highly dependent on a vehicle. It's also to recognize that EVs have lower emissions and lower operating costs, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And getting to the services that we all depend on, whether it be healthcare, whether it be shopping for groceries, whatever the case might be, access to mobility is again critical for those things. So EVs help address climate action and contribute to community resilience. At the outset, I mentioned who would have thought 20 years ago, right, that we are where we are today. And I would suggest that EV adoption is growing, and this is to recognize it's not growing evenly, but globally, and that's where this country is and will be over time, there is rapid growth happening with EVs. And in fact, it's now 20% of new car sales, and we can see some significant change in the allocation of how those cars are being sold in terms of the companies we might look at here in North America versus what's happening globally. And even though sales have maybe flattened just a little bit in Canada, we're in that sort of 10 to 15% range for new car sales. Still, in 2025, there was 170,000 EVs were sold in this country. And it also contributes because it means that increasingly there are EVs coming off leases, which will help to lower the price as well for folks as they might purchase. And in the US, of course, it's a little bit slower. Government support has transitioned a little bit, but I'm sure all of us have reflections on what's happening south of the border. The transition is underway, and I think for rural communities, it's critical that we think about it and anticipate how we further that change because of its advantages from an economic and an environmental perspective. And some of the things that we'll talk about as our presentation goes along in further detail. This is where rural Ontario, I think, people will often think of EVs as an urban solution. I think they're a rural solution for a variety of reasons, one of which is the cost of operating a vehicle is much less for an EV. And that number of 300 versus 3,000, if I'm driving 20,000 kilometers a year, I'm probably paying gasoline of approximately 3,000, whereas charging at home, I'm $300 or less. And I think that's really critical for folks to think about. It's often easier to charge at home also in rural communities. I'm reflecting on us having a condo in Guelph for a period of time while we still had our place here in Huron, and how difficult it was for somebody in that condo to be able to charge their vehicle. They had to have chargers installed. Whereas here in rural Ontario, most of us, a much larger percentage, live in private homes, and that makes it easier to establish a charger, for example. And I would suggest that EVs are becoming increasingly affordable. So there's a variety of lenses that come to this topic from my perspective. Certainly, there's an economic lens and there's an environmental lens. And I think the economic lens exists in the context of us as individuals, but there's also an economic lens which exists in the context of rural municipalities. And when I say rural municipalities, I'm including our small towns and villages as part of that as well. Do people come to your community or do they go elsewhere? Just a little by happenstance, my wife and I are meeting her sisters later this week, and we're all coming together. And in fact, the community that we're going to go to, we selected specifically because it has a level 3 charger. And while I probably have enough juice to get there and get home again, it's nice to know that there's a level 3 charger, which Jason will talk about in a bit more detail in a few moments. So it's important to us personally, if we have an EV in terms of the economics of it, but I would suggest that from a tourist and economic development perspective, it's also critically important for rural communities in terms of people being comfortable coming to your community or not. And as an experience as an EV owner, we think about these things, whether there's chargers available or not. And certainly, if we look at it from a perspective of climate and emissions reductions, we all wonder, how can we contribute to a reduced impact on climate in a way that's positive? And I know there's debate around this at times, but I think for folks who have taken the time to look at climate change and what the impacts will be, they will recognize that we need to do what we can to do in order to reduce emissions, not only for ourselves, but for future generations as well. And I think EVs are part of that discussion. So there's a lot of words here. I'm not going to go over all of them. There are certain keywords that I want to bring to your attention, and it's this notion of planning, it's this notion of partnerships, and it's this notion of enabling infrastructure. And we'll come back to this a little bit later, but from a planning perspective, there's a number of things that can be done, ranging from how you deal with your official plan and transportation plans and climate action plans, as an example, through to planning for equity, making sure that people have access in rural and underserviced areas, and also as part of equity, people that might have limitations in terms of mobility, that they can access chargers and things of that nature as well. So there's lots of stuff that can occur from a planning perspective. And partnerships, I think, are really critical as well. And it's not to say that all of the responsibility for an EV network falls to municipalities. There's many private businesses offering it, car dealerships as an example, that will often have publicly available chargers. But it's to think through, from a partnership perspective, have we addressed what needs to occur in our community to make sure that people have access to chargers, that they have access to the services that they might require. So collaboration with other levels of government, utilities, and Indigenous communities, as an example. Engaging local businesses, as mentioned often, there are local businesses providing charging, and community organizations as well. I don't know if I should be shouting out a specific business, but the Caldwell at Blythe, always like going there, because they have actually, it's you just go in, and as a service to their customers, they provide free charging, as an example. And building public trust through engagement and transparency. And I think that's really helpful. We'll talk about some myths a little bit later, and addressing those myths, I think, is also important. And of course, the enabling infrastructure that's required in terms of priority locations. Where do we want to ensure that chargers are available, whether it be at places of work and business, or whether it be for the public who might be traveling through your community. Fleet electrification. Some municipalities have gone a long way to make sure that they have electric vehicles available for staff, and ensuring that infrastructure is reliable, accessible, and ready for the future. So in terms of being ready for the future, I'm going to pass this on to Jason, who's going to share with us some of his experiences.
Thank you, Wayne. Yeah, so I wanted to start off my part of the conversation just as a EV enthusiast and user, as explain the different levels of the chargers. Because as part of my journey into an EV driver, I had to do a lot of research and prepare. And so the level 1 chargers, you're generally going to get those given to you along with your car. It would be an emergency charger, and it's just going to plug into your standard 120 volt outlet. Those are convenient. However, they're going to take you upwards of 24 hours to charge your vehicle. So those are generally not even really considered a charger unless you have a lot of time on your hands in between driving. The level 2 chargers, kind of your more standard charger that you're going to see in areas. So a common home or business charger uses a 240 volt plug, which would be the same as like your dryer. You're probably going to have this professionally installed in your home, and it's going to have onboard software on it as well that will allow you to pick times as to when your vehicle's going to charge. Communities have also put in level 2 chargers. They give you you're still going to be looking at 6 to 10 hours to bring a vehicle up to a full charge. And then the level 3 chargers, those are also known as a DC fast charger. This is where you're going to see your Tesla chargers or your bigger high capacity chargers from major companies. And those are put into areas where you either want traffic coming in, you want lots of vehicles, or you're going to be providing that service. So a lot of the en route service centers now throughout Ontario have those level 3 chargers available, and big banks of them. So you can go in, you can charge for about 30 minutes, and you're back on your drive again. So the reason that was important for myself with my journey into EV driving is when we first bought our EV, we researched for quite a long time, but we ended up buying one sooner than we had thought we were going to buy one. So it came with that level 1 charger, and we didn't have a level 2 charger at home. And so we relied on those community level 2 or level 3 chargers until we got to a point where we could have our level 2 charger installed. So it was very important for us for those community chargers to start with. We originally moved to the EVs kind of the same reason I think most people do. You don't want to be paying for fuel anymore, and there's also that added element of environmental awareness where you didn't want those carbon emissions any longer. One of the groups that I used quite a bit in my purchase of an EV was a group known as Plug and Drive. They're not for profit, and they're also they'll come into your communities often, and there's other drivers and enthusiasts that bring their own EVs, and they offer opportunities for you to test drive. They're there to help you with the journey, any of your questions. So I used them quite a bit. Was able to test drive quite a few EVs and be able to make that decision before I started. My wife and I both have a fairly hefty commute in the mornings for work. So as I put it on here, research. We had spreadsheets plotted out of like plug-in hybrids versus full electric vehicles. And just our commutes were not conducive to having a plug-in hybrid. We would have been using gas to come home every time. So it made more sense for us to have an EV that had a higher range to it. So that was where we ended up going. We had, so we plan ahead. We need to make sure that when you are purchasing your EV that you're probably going to have a charger installed fairly quickly or at the same time as bringing it home. That's the big mistake I think I had made but then we had these communities, we started to find where those communities were that had the level 3 chargers that would allow us a lot quicker time to charge up. So I know Wayne and I had talked about this as well. You start to get your favorite chargers on your routes, and we're also big travelers. We've done many road trips in our lifetime, and so those were the questions I was able to ask even in the plug and drive. Was this is the scenario, this is why I drive, and this is how I drive, so what would be best suited for myself? So we are now owner of 2 EVs. We have a 2023 Ford F-150 Lightning, and then we have a 2024 Hyundai Ioniq 5. As in the previous picture there, the reason we had the truck was I have 2 daughters that are about to head off to college. They're avid surfers, they're avid paddleboarders. We have lots and lots of equipment that needs to be carried all over the place. So the truck makes sense. One of the things that we did not really plan on getting the truck, we also do camping, hauling garden materials. We have a Great Dane as well. So we needed that extra storage, but we got some very unplanned for benefits of having it. So my wife driving it in the wintertime, different than other pickup trucks. Anybody who does drive a pickup truck will realize you always have that problem of very light back end. That you don't get that problem with an electric truck because the battery packs are all usually distributed throughout the bottom of the truck, so it's heavy and stays fairly heavy down low, so it's got a better base to it for driving in the winter, and then it's higher up, so it's almost like driving a tank through snowstorms. And my wife really appreciates that, driving in the morning, so she ends up taking the car quite a bit, or the truck. But the Great Dane loves it. But we didn't. One of the other things that is pictured here that we weren't planning for, especially with the Ford Lightning, is that they do when they market this as a fleet vehicle, there's plugs all throughout this vehicle where they're expecting you to be able to go to a job site, plug in your saw, or in this case, your coffee maker when you have a power outage. So they even allow you the ability to harness the battery of your vehicle back through our charger, and you can use it as a generator for your home. So there's a lot of bonuses to driving electric vehicles that you don't necessarily think of right away. You're just thinking, okay, I'm saving the environment and I'm not putting gas in anymore. And there's so much more that that you can take care of in the day to day that you wouldn't have thought. But yeah, I think that's it for my part of the presentation. Moving on to Derry.
Perfect. Thanks, Jason. I think it's really important to hear from those with experience with EVs because for us without them, we would never know about the pluses of a coffee maker. And that just shines light too on the emergency preparedness you have for those power outages that are also happening more and more as the climate changes. So that's great. Just doing a little bit of a recap on what we are learning from experience from EV drivers across the board, and obviously the two today in Wayne and Jason, is that more charging is happening at home on a regular basis. It's obviously the most convenient, but also the most cost effective for EV drivers. And when each of you think about maybe your normal daily activities, I'm assuming on a normal week, you may not be driving over 200 to 400 kilometers on a day. So it is pretty easy to be able to charge at home each night. Fast chargers are also, so those DC level 3 chargers that Jason touched on, those are the ones that are really shaping where EV drivers can go and where they can access, especially when considering their trip planning. And obviously the travel is still possible in rural areas. That's been proven in Ontario, but also in other provinces, as I'm sure other countries. But it does require usually a little more planning on behalf of that driver. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, I'm going to touch on more of the municipal side and that partnership aspect that Wayne brought up earlier, and a real life example of how a partnership is helping with the transition to EVs in southwestern Ontario. The partnership is colloquial in the partners is known as Rural Recharge, although that may not be the most publicly known name. But essentially, this partnership actually goes back until 2021. So it's 5 years old now, which is great to see that it's still going between the municipalities. But in 2021, there were 6 counties, the city of Guelph, city of Stratford, and the town of St. Mary's. So in that study area you can see on the map, that joined together and wanted to create an electric vehicle charging network that spanned the entire region, obviously with several goals in mind. But at the time, obviously to be most cost effective, especially for rural municipalities, they may not have as many staff resources or access to financial resources either. They were able to apply to the Federation of Canadian their Green Municipal Fund, which is funding a lot of climate mitigation projects, to receive funding to create that electric vehicle charging station network implementation study for the entire region. And essentially the main goals of the partnership, a lot of the municipalities that were partnering or the staff involved were more of the environmental mindset or the climate change specialists. So there was a large goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the community. And like Wayne touched on too, a lot of transportation in rural areas is done by private vehicles. So that's a key sector and does actually lead to a large portion of community emissions in the study region. There's also that idea with this region to bridge the gap that existed at the time between the 401 corridor and the Lake Huron, Georgian Bay area. As Jason mentioned, there's a lot of chargers at en routes now, so along those major highways, but rural areas weren't the prominent targets for some of those private companies to invest in. So the idea of the partnership was to essentially incentivize someone to invest in the region economically and in a sustainable fashion. So there was the goal of boosting economic development and tourism locally by bringing ideally more EV owners and drivers in from the larger city centers around us, as well as potentially accelerating EV adoption locally with folks that live in rural areas and getting that knowledge base that there is charging stations available that they can use when necessary. So the funding that partnership got back in 2021 was allowed them to hire a private consultant known as Community Energy Association to essentially conduct a local survey of both EV and non-EV driver and owners. It also did a literature review and looked at similar models that were being done in other provinces at the time to create these rural networks. And they did a whole siting analysis as well. And essentially at the end, an implementation strategy was created. Next slide, please, Wayne. Perfect. So these are some maps that were done as part of the analysis. So the two maps on the left of the screen show where at the time, so in 2021 and 2022, this is where the existing EV infrastructure was in the study area. So on the far left, it's level threes, so those fast chargers, and then on the right or in the middle, you'll see where the level two chargers were, which again are very useful and do help drive a lot of that economic development because it means people have to drive somewhere and park their car for potentially up to 4 to 8 hours to get that full battery level back. So that's where the existing one was. And as part of the strategy, the consultants looked at where the gaps were, which are seemingly a bit obvious too on the map, as well along the major corridors, as well as things like what amenities or economic development opportunities or services are there in those particular areas where there are gaps, as well as the utility and capacity of the electrical grid. The different level chargers do require those different levels of power. So that's oftentimes a large consideration and contributes a lot to potentially the cost of what it would be to install the different levels of chargers. I believe there might have been a question about the cost of level threes to install, and it ranges closer to the $200,000 range, and that can be with or without how many utility upgrades you have to do in that area. So it can range quite significantly, and that's a large amount of money for potentially a business owner to invest in or a municipality, for example. So the map, I guess, on the far right, I'll just touch on is where the partnership established that new chargers could be put to, again, connect all those major corridors in the region so that when people were coming in or even locals were leaving, there was those abilities to charge throughout, and you didn't have to pick necessarily the only one highway that could get you all the way up to the Bruce Peninsula, for example. There's opportunities to hit more of the rural small towns as well. Next slide, please, Wayne. Perfect. So obviously this partnership has gone on for 5 years. So over the course of the project, based on the implementation study, those areas were designated for chargers. Obviously, since then, certain chargers have been put in by private businesses, for example, and some of those gaps have been filled naturally. So the partnership has evolved since then, and at the current time, there's still 5 counties involved that are working with Community Energy Association and a third-party implementation partner, so a private company that would be installing and owning and operating, ideally, the level 3 chargers, as well as some level 2 chargers throughout the region to fill in those gaps. That partnership because they created that incentive for a private company to want to invest in the region because it's not just one charger, for example, it's multiple across the area. And those private companies do recognize the amount of tourism that does flow through this particular area as well. They see the benefit in that, so they have that interest to invest a lot of their upfront capital into these projects. And the partnership was also able to obtain additional funding from the Ministry of Transportation's Charge On funding stream that some of you may or may not be aware of, that I think started around two years ago at this point, and they're on the second intake now. So that's again creates more incentive for those private companies and to invest in these rural municipalities. The motivations of the private companies may be more potentially profit driven sometimes than the environmental aspect, but all the municipalities and counties involved still have that climate lens on the project, that their goal is to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions, reduce pollution in the local areas, which can obviously improve overall community health as well, and even reduce those long-term impacts that we are seeing from climate change because of emissions. From, again, private vehicles can be a large portion of those as well. So there is those additional benefits to socially, economically, environmentally, and obviously for community health. And just a plug-in too for these plug-in, and I didn't mean that as a pun for the EV owners out there, but this is a good example of a rural partnership across municipalities that has actually led to additional partnerships since, with some of those same municipalities in the climate change, either mitigation or adaptation areas. So it's really nice to see how this work can transition to just more benefits and more investments and opportunities in rural areas that can help communities become more resilient long term. So obviously this is a great example, but Wayne did mention there is obviously some myths, so we will transition to those now and lead you through some of the ones that exist and maybe some of the ways that we can demystify them for you.
Thanks very much, Derry. Over the balance of our presentation, Derry and I are going to share a few slides, and I'll start with just mentioning we're going to talk about myths, and we find that's kind of a fun way to think about the topic, because I suspect those folks listening today will be able to think of the myths that they may have heard as well, and we'll see whether we cover the ones that come to your mind. And the first one is this myth that EVs will overload the electricity grid. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on this, because most people will charge at home overnight. And if we look at the graph on the right-hand side, you can see that when we hit our peak of energy demand in Ontario, most of that's around midday through till the evening. Whereas most EVs, mine, for example, I'm programmed, it does not start charging until 7 p.m. and it doesn't charge past 7 a.m. And usually it's those hours in between that the charging happens at. And as you can see from this graphic, in fact, that's the point of time when we have the lowest energy demand within the province. So charging occurs during off-peak hours. There's also really attractive because that's when the price of energy is the lowest as a consumer. And of course, there's smart meters and so on. And in my context, it's right within the car itself. You just program when you want it to charge or not. And as slick as a button, that works well.
Thanks, Wayne. So myth number 2 generally falls around, well, we do have public chargers, so the problem must be solved there. As I kind of hinted at, there are a lot of communities that have level 2 chargers. So again, that middle of the range charger that takes a good chunk of your day. So if you are at your office, for example, for 8 hours, it's a perfect opportunity to charge. But there's a very large gap in the level 3 infrastructure that exists. Again, that cost that I mentioned, that upfront cost, it's a large, expensive asset, for example, for municipalities to own and to add to their repertoire of maintenance and ongoing management. So that's where creating that incentive for private companies to invest in rural communities is very important for EV infrastructure. And again, those level 2s are good if you're staying somewhere long, but if you are traveling, like Wayne and Jason have both mentioned, they're choosing communities that most likely have a level 3 charger available to them. So that is also what's driving that economic development aspect and potentially tourism. And again, in this particular like Southwestern Ontario region, that is a large drive in the summertime. And there is peak usage normally during the summer months of EV chargers in those areas as well. Yes, one other point, which again we've heard several times, I already touched on it, but a direct quote from another EV owner. So you're seeing it's one of those trends where it's not just Wayne saying this or not just Jason, but it's a common thought process for most EV owners is they want to be able to charge similar to those who fill up their gas tank, right? It takes 2 to 3 minutes maybe potentially with a stop. So they want that ability to not have to wait at a charging station for hours on end, hanging out in their vehicle potentially. Although I have learned that Teslas have Netflix in it, so you can just watch Netflix apparently while charging, which is a fun way to pass the time at least. Myth number three is around that expense piece, and I'm sure Wayne and Jason have those real life numbers to compare to. Like Wayne mentioned earlier, 3,300 is a large difference on annual expenses when everything else in life is also becoming more expensive. Gas, as we have seen recently, has become very expensive. And the idea of those upfront costs when purchasing, it is generally still higher to purchase an EV upfront, but that life cycle costing of understanding how later in the process of owning that EV, the longer you own it, essentially the more you're going to save in maintenance costs because oil changes aren't required, because they just have fewer moving parts in general. Those operating costs are so much lower for EVs. And the reduced brake wear because of regenerative braking is also a different aspect in EVs that folks may or may not think of on a regular basis. And in general, while charging at home is still an electricity cost, so it will increase your utility bill when you think about it, it is still significantly cheaper than charging or purchasing gas at a gas station right now, or even when you do have an EV and you do have to purchase from a public or private charging station, those prices are still currently much lower to get a full tank of electricity than it would be to get a full tank of fuel.
Folks will often, sometimes, and I think it's a myth, comment that EVs don't work in rural areas. And I think there are a variety of reasons, and we've touched upon many of them already. It's this notion that I think it's easier in many rural communities to have off-street charging, basically at your home. It's not terribly expensive to have a level 2 charger installed, for example. Many EVs have a range of 400 to 500 kilometers, and it's not that often, for example, that I'm driving more than 400 kilometers in a day. And if I am, then I plan out where I'm about to head to. And less congestion on the roads means you have a really efficient use of your vehicle in that context. So in many cases, rural communities aren't a barrier. I think they're an advantage and something that those of us living in rural communities can benefit from. Fifth is that this notion that EV adoption has already peaked. Yeah, we've gone through this little flare of EV use and ownership, and we're past that. But if we look at things globally, and you can see in the chart on the right-hand side, you can see, how quickly we've gone in 2020 globally from just a little over 2.5 million sales to 2024 at 17.5 million vehicles sold globally, and that increased again last year. So we can look at this at what's happening in the US, and that's where a lot of our media comes from. But if we think of what's happening globally, we're on this path, and that's where we're going to. Infrastructure and affordability are catching up. We mentioned that earlier, and governments and manufacturers remain committed. Even though there have been some changes, there's still new vehicles coming out all the time, and more variety, more selection, and I think that continues to be a positive.
Awesome. Well, the last myth that at least we'll touch on today is around that environmental impact of EVs. And it is not zero. No one can begin to say that. EV production, especially the battery aspect of it, does have environmental impacts. But again, I think a lot of focus in the environmental world is on the circular economy part, but also on those life cycle assessments and understanding life cycle impacts. So while there could be more upfront impacts with an EV, long term, there's substantially fewer emissions used for them than compared to their gasoline vehicles as well. And luckily in Ontario, when you are thinking about the use of the vehicle long term, our electricity grid is relatively low carbon compared to potentially other locations in Canada or even in other countries. So we're very lucky in that aspect. And battery recycling, along with other technology improvements, are continuously happening in the private sectors. That's an area a lot of them are focused on. And at the same time, when you do compare those, again, life cycle impacts from an EV compared to your combustion engine, it is still, most of these assessments do show that over the lifespan of an electric vehicle, there is less environmental impacts than a combustion engine. Obviously, it's not perfect. This isn't the end all be all solution for all emissions that we have and are putting into the environment. But it is improving over time, and the knowledge and the research going into this field is constantly evolving and growing, which is again leads to Wayne's point that the interest in EVs is still growing, but also the interest in improving them is still on the rise as well. So just a few key takeaways. Again, you've probably heard us say these maybe multiple times, but a lot of the concerns that folks have with potentially purchasing an electric vehicle are relatively outdated. Again, new information is coming every day, every week, every month from all different sectors in all different countries. So it's oftentimes really hard to keep up with it. And that's maybe noted through Jason's idea that he had to do so much research too to figure out how he was going to transition to EVs. Some of the myths and concerns can be really misunderstood, such as the rural aspect and how there can actually be several benefits to having one in a rural community and compared to even an urban area. And lastly, a lot of people are trying to address all the concerns that folks have. They want to make technology that is useful. And obviously, a lot of these companies want to make it profitable as well for themselves. So they want to continuously improve it and make it more financially accessible for people, but also ideally reduce that environmental impact too.
So just a summary, couple of slides. The first question is, what can municipalities do? There was the detailed slide earlier that had a number of options that can be looked at, but 5 practical actions. I think municipalities can make sure zoning and site plan policies encourage and accommodate EVs and accommodate charging facilities as an example. A plan for the equitable charger placement, and Derry was speaking to that earlier, making sure, and it was interesting that first map you shared, Derry, if I might, that showed where there were not level 3 chargers, and several of the communities I visit that are close enough to home, I don't really need to worry about it, but particularly communities along the Lake Huron shoreline that might not have a level 3 charger, in my view, that would be a concern for people that might be traveling from Toronto, as an example. So plan for that equitable charger placement, make sure there are no gaps. Design for accessibility, and accessibility can be looked at in a variety of ways, and we talked about that earlier as well. I think municipalities can reach out to others for the partnerships. And again, Derry covered that in a variety of ways, but partnerships with businesses and industries that might be interested in establishing EVs, or other community groups that might be able to assist as well, and lead by example. And this just happens to be the photo in the background at Huron View. And you can see the charging facilities that the county has provided there. So to me, that's leading by example to ensure that facilities are available where people might be able to use them and benefit from them. So final thoughts, and I have to say that I'm a booster. I support the notion of EVs, and I'm hoping that's not clouding my judgment too much, but they are coming. And we look at it globally, we see the sales that are happening, they are coming. To me, the question is not if, but how. And how can rural communities lead in that context? And people might look at that top photo and wonder, why is there a picture of the train station? And I'm reminded of the debates that went on within municipalities and communities going back more than 100 years ago, where if you weren't on the rail line, you were doomed as a community. And I think there's a little bit of truth in that. It's not as extreme, but there's a little bit of truth in that from communities thinking about making sure that the network is in place to support people who might want to travel to your community with an electric vehicle. And finally, I'm going to turn it back to Sage, but a couple of questions that we'll pose to folks that might be listening. What is your experience with EVs if you happen to be an EV owner? What is your experience charging, and any other observations you might have? And I'll mention that the article that Sage alluded to earlier is available in Municipal World from September of 2025. And if people want a more detailed written explanation, discussion of these kinds of topics, they can source out that article. Over to you, Sage.
Well, thank you so much. And I liked a lot of the themes that were coming through more generally about about research being an important component, but also healthy sources of skepticism combined with myth busting to really get at the root of what is the reality of electric vehicle ownership. So if you do have any questions, please add your questions to the question and answer box below, and they will be answered by our speakers. So I do have one that has been burning from my end. Is a key part of this discussion is the connection between climate change and community health. Why is it important to start building climate resilience now for community health? And I'll direct that one to Derry.
Thanks, Sage. Yeah, it's a really important question. I think climate change impacts people in all areas of life. It impacts them at the individual level as well as at the community level. I obviously fully believe that the climate is changing and there is a human aspect of that. And we're seeing impacts on our community on a regular basis. Because of that, we're seeing more extreme weather events like storms and floods and heat waves. And particular heat waves can have really impactful community health outcomes. So if there's existing health considerations for individuals or respiratory concerns, that can just exacerbate them. If there's not enough shade, that can lead to heat stress on a regular basis. And it doesn't even need to be someone who's doing a lot of strenuous activity necessarily, with some of the temperatures going into the 40s with humidity in Southern Ontario. And there can either be physical impacts to health from storms or floods, or even displacements in some areas if you can no longer live in your home. So there's impacts that we're seeing across communities that do have health implications. And when you really take all that in consideration, it's important to be proactive to really reduce those emissions, or really we should have been reducing emissions decades ago, but to start doing that now as much as we can and really start building that momentum to create opportunities where communities can adapt to the climate that we're projected to see as well in the coming years. So reducing exposure to climate-related hazards that impact our health and our community is really key in my mind, and a large focus of a lot of the work that I like to do. This could be things like EV chargers that are transitioning individuals away from those combustion engines. It gives them that other option where for the longest time, if you needed a car, you needed a car. And that was the only option. Even having electric vehicle trucks now is a large advancement as well in that technology. And it really helps reduce pollution and in turn reduce global warming, which again just adds to that reduced impact on the climate. Even adding in street trees, for example, can be a small little idea that can really help in those extreme heat events, creating shade for individuals that are out and about, minding their own business, doing their own thing, and even emergency preparedness kits, or folks understanding what should be included in that for a 72-hour period, because some of these storms we're seeing may leave you without access to services or even to your communities if roads are closed for multiple days or power is out, for example. So there's lots of little ways to do it in different ways that do impact health, but also impact community resilience at the same time. Hopefully that answered your question.
That was fantastic. And I did see somebody ask, can we have this presentation sent to us at the end of the session? All of these webinars are recorded and available 7 p.m. the same day on the Gateway YouTube channel. And we did have a question, which I will kind of blend with one that was burning in my mind from Jenny. I hope the survey and planners consider when they plan where to locate level 3 chargers. Please ensure there is a public washroom, and they go into the various amenities that are located. In Goderich, I know there are electric vehicle chargers located at the museum. Why is the placement of chargers important within a community? I'm going to direct this question to Wayne. And how can you plan for it?
Sure. I think it's a great question because, as I'm traveling around, I will observe where people have put level 2 and level 3 chargers. And I think level 2 chargers work well. And as Derry mentioned as well, where someone is going to be for the day, right, or for a long period of time. So the level 2 chargers in front of the museum, I would typically, if I'm at a museum, I'm probably there for 3 or 4 hours. It works fine. If I'm, though, traveling to and through a community, I think it's really important that the level 3 chargers be visible, easily found, so that people know they're there and can take advantage of them. And I just think it's really critical to do that in a thoughtful way, so that people will be encouraged to use them. And not only that, that the local community will benefit from the economics of people visiting that community. And the comment about a washroom, the older I get, the more important that is. So can't agree more.
Amazing. And I did have a question I think I'll direct to Jason. Any myth busting you can speak to about winter impact on driving and distance in rural areas?
Actually, that's not much of a myth. There is an impact. I know with taking my truck, for example, if I were to charge it to 100% during the summer, the range is indicated as 515 kilometers that I could travel with that. During the winter, there are smart systems on board. They do realize that the temperature is lower. It does impact that battery usage and that battery charging. So that same 515 kilometers is maybe down to about 420 kilometers during the winter. So it does require that planning to make sure with our day-to-day commutes, it doesn't affect us really, because we purchased vehicles that had a larger range ahead of time, keeping that in mind that we want to make sure that we're still going to get there even with that degraded ability during those peak cold times. But yeah, it does affect just slightly that battery and the ability to charge as well. So if you just drive up with a cold battery to a charger and you plug it in, you're going to find that it's going to start off a lot slower to charge it while it heats up that battery. So it's not really a myth. It is something that's going to come into effect, but I don't really find it that much of a problem in my day-to-day.
If I might jump in, Sage, I'm just trying to monitor some of the Q&A questions. There's lots of great questions, and I'm sure we're not likely going to have time to answer all of them. But there was one comment about a municipal office and the council kiboshing the idea of establishing a charger. What I think is really relevant is that at a municipal office, for staff, as an example, having a level 2 charger would be absolutely perfect. Right. And my level 2 charger, I think the unit itself was about $500 and the cost of installation was less than $1,000. So for $1,000 to $1,500, that's the cost of establishing the level 2 charger. I would think a municipality would be able to afford that.
And while we're on the subject, Dr. Wayne Caldwell, you and Derry discussed some of the myths regarding electric vehicles and electric vehicle ownership. We had another speaker once call certain ideas like these zombie ideas, because they kept coming back to life. How can planners, community developers, and interested community members help dispel some of these myths that arise?
It's an interesting question, and I think it comes back to, and I see myths in a whole lot of other categories too, where people develop a perspective based on something they saw in the media without questioning the authenticity of the information. So I think, first of all, we should all do our information, just as Jason spent a lot of time figuring out, was an EV going to work for him? I think it's relevant for all of us to be asking that same question. What are the realities of it? And I continue to run into people that I'm thinking they've either never ridden in an EV, or they certainly haven't owned one, and they have no direct experience to reflect on. Because from my experience, I know you spoke, Jason, about the winter driving, and yeah, there's some things you have to come to grips with there, but so too does the range of your gas-powered vehicle drop in the wintertime, right? So I think it's about trying to become as informed as possible, sharing that information collegially as best as you can, and knowing that this is a train we're on and it's not going back.
I guess I'll just add to that too. I feel like a benefit of the speakers today is, I mean, I own a hybrid, but it's not a plug-in hybrid, so I really can't talk. But both Wayne and Jason have that direct experience, and I think leveraging those voices when in communications, in webinars such as these, is so important because I can say a list of things I read on Google or that's concrete in research, but having someone actually solidify that that is true in Canada, in Ontario, in the rural context, I think is really important for folks to hear from. And generally, it's more believable as well, in my experience.
If I might as well, Sage, I saw an interesting email or text message or Q&A, I should say. I haven't absorbed all of it, but I have an EV dealer talk about maintenance. And obviously, each of us in our own context will have to evaluate it. One of the things I think is really interesting is, and many people will be aware of how prevalent the Toyota Highlander has been over time, right? As a vehicle that people would rely on, sort of a heavy. Toyota's going exclusively to an EV Highlander that will be out there, I think, starting this coming fall. And it just speaks to me about the transition that car dealerships are making as well, about coming to grips with understanding what people need and trying to make sure that it works well. And all I can say is from my own personal experience, maintenance has been, I change the tires and that's it.
I would second that, what Wayne has said. Like, I think I pay maybe $100 every 6 months in maintenance. Like, it's absolutely nothing. I've almost forgotten what it's like to go and take a car to the shop.
So I think that we've already gone through quite a few questions regarding the actual maintenance of a vehicle. And there has been a question in the chat that I think an attendee actually answered to the effect about EV owners. The vehicles are heavier, they wear down um, the highways faster, and there's also some concerns about how these are taxed to maintain the road infrastructure. And there are some suggestions about benefits to reemission. Does anybody want to add anything to that further?
I'll jump in and say I think it's a really interesting question and it's a fair question. And in time, if we get to the point that the majority of people are driving EVs, I have no problem with paying for EVs in some other form. As it is today, most people are paying for that through gas taxes, and that's their choice. And if people are incentivized to buy an EV and that contributes to that decision, I'd say that's a positive, a fair point. But I'm not sure. I think governments are at this point, at least this side of the American border, are still encouraging people to buy EVs and to make that transition from a climate change and other perspective. And I think that's equally a public benefit.
Thank you for adding to that, Wayne. And we do have a couple of people that are saying thank you. And I unfortunately can't get to everything, so I am going to wrap this webinar up. Thank you to the presenters. If you do have any thoughts, please contact and reach out to Gateway. We would like to thank the following sponsors for their continued support. Without them, the lecture series would not be possible. These include CIBC Wealth Management, Hurontel, Libro Credit Union, McGee Motors Goderich, Lighthouse Money Management, McEwen and Fagan Insurance, and Zagers Goderich. Gateway Center of Excellence in Rural Health is a not-for-profit organization with charitable status, and we greatly appreciate and welcome any support we receive. Parents and grandparents, if you are in the crowd, if you know a high school student, the Discovery Healthcare Camp registration is still open. This is an opportunity to be inspired by healthcare workers, led by medical students at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. We will be continuing the conversation on other topics related to rural health on June 2nd, 2026 for a discussion on can smartphone apps impact substance use and mental health. a look at the evidence featuring Dr. Mike Beasley, who is a professor at the University of Waterloo School of Pharmacy. Thank you again to our panel sponsors and especially you for tuning in. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.